The words did not sound real at first. They hung in the dining room like something that belonged to another family, another mother, another daughter. But then I saw my mother's face, and I knew she meant every syllable. I wish she'd never been my daughter. It was Mother's Day, the one day of the year when I had spent my entire life trying to make her feel loved, and somehow, in less than 10 seconds, she had made me feel as though my entire existence had been a mistake. I stood there holding a small white box containing the necklace I had saved for 3 months to buy, while my younger brother sat silently at the table, staring at his plate. My mother looked away from me as if she had already forgotten what she had said. But I would remember it for the rest of my life. Before we go any further, if you believe that kindness can heal wounds that anger creates, if you believe people deserve second chances, and if you have ever loved someone who struggled to love you back, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps these emotional stories reach people who may be silently going through something similar. My name is Emma, and for most of my life, I believed my mother and I were simply different. She was practical, reserved, and proud. I was emotional, hopeful, and stubbornly determined to see the good in people. She believed love was something you proved through sacrifice. I believed love was something you gave even when nobody asked for it. Growing up, I learned very early that my mother had expectations for me that I could never quite reach. My younger brother, Daniel, seemed to fit effortlessly into the life she had imagined. He was confident, athletic, successful in school, and eventually became the kind of young man relatives praised whenever he entered a room. I was quieter. I loved books, drawing, old movies, and helping people. I was the child who would spend an afternoon sitting beside an injured bird until it was strong enough to fly. My mother called those things distractions. Daniel called them kindness. Somehow, I always felt as though I needed to prove that being different did not mean being disappointing. When I was 8, my father left. There was no dramatic goodbye. There was no final embrace in the rain. One morning, his closet was half empty, and my mother told me he had gone away because things between adults sometimes became complicated. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed that night, clutching an old photograph of the three of us, trying to understand how someone could simply decide not to be part of a family anymore. My mother changed after that. She became harder, more exhausted, and more determined to survive. She worked long hours, counted every bill twice, and rarely complained. I admired her for that. Even when she snapped at me, even when she dismissed my dreams, even when she compared me to other girls, I told myself she was tired. I told myself she had been hurt. I told myself that underneath all that hardness was the mother who had once held me against her chest when I had a fever. That belief became the foundation of my entire childhood. Whenever she hurt me, I found an explanation for her. When she forgot my school performance, I told myself she had been working. When she criticized the dress I had worn to graduation, I told myself she wanted me to look respectable. When she told me art would never provide a stable future, I told myself she was afraid I would struggle. Whenever she praised Daniel and barely acknowledged my accomplishments, I told myself that mothers sometimes showed love differently. I became an expert at translating cruelty into concern because admitting that my mother might simply not understand how much she was hurting me felt too painful. After high school, I moved to another city for college. It was the first time I had ever lived more than a few hours away from home, and for the first few months, I felt guilty almost every day. I called my mother constantly. I sent pictures of my tiny apartment, my classes, the cheap meals I cooked, and the sketches I made late at night. Sometimes she answered. Sometimes she didn't. When she did, she usually asked about Daniel. How was his job search? Had he found a better apartment? Was he eating properly? I would listen and wait for her to ask about me. Sometimes she did eventually, but usually only after I reminded her. Still, I kept calling. College was difficult. I worked part-time at a small community center while studying design. There were nights when I came home so tired that I fell asleep with my shoes still on. I learned to stretch one bag of groceries across an entire week. I repaired my old laptop with borrowed tools because I could not afford another one. There were moments when I considered quitting. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered something my father had once told me before he left, that I had a gift for noticing beauty where other people saw nothing. I wanted to believe that gift mattered. During my final year, I started designing invitations and small business logos for people in the neighborhood. One client recommended me to another, and slowly, my little side business began to grow. It wasn't glamorous. I worked from a second-hand desk beside a window that barely closed during winter. But for the first time, I was earning money from something I genuinely loved. I began saving every extra dollar. I had one dream that I never told my mother about because I was afraid she would laugh at it. I wanted to buy a small apartment. It wasn't about luxury. I wanted a place where nobody could suddenly tell me I didn't belong. I wanted walls painted in colors I chose, shelves filled with books I loved, a little kitchen where I could make tea at midnight, and a small balcony where I could grow herbs. I wanted a home that could never be taken away by someone's anger. Years passed. My business grew. I still spoke to my mother every week. Daniel eventually moved back home after losing his job, and my mother spent most of her energy helping him get back on his feet. I didn't resent him for it. At least I tried not to. Whenever my mother needed help paying a bill, I sent money. Whenever she needed groceries, I ordered them. When her car needed repairs, I covered the cost. I never mentioned what I was sacrificing. I simply told myself that family helped family. Then, finally, I found the apartment. It was small, older than the buildings around it, and nowhere near the fashionable part of town. The kitchen was narrow, the bathroom needed repairs, and the hallway had faded paint. But when I opened the front door for the first time, I stood in the empty living room and cried. Sunlight came through the windows. The floor creaked beneath my shoes. Somewhere outside, a child was laughing. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I decided to tell my mother on Mother's Day. I wanted the day to be special. I bought her favorite flowers. I prepared the dessert she used to make when I was a child. I spent weeks searching for the right gift, eventually finding a delicate silver necklace with a tiny pendant shaped like a tree. To me, it represented everything she had survived and everything I believed she had given me. I wrapped it carefully and placed it inside a white box. That morning, I drove to her house with my heart pounding. I imagined telling her about the apartment. I imagined her hugging me. I imagined her finally looking at me with pride instead of disappointment. The afternoon began peacefully enough. Daniel was there too. My mother sat at the head of the table, and I watched her unwrap the necklace. For a brief moment, I saw something soften in her expression. Then Daniel mentioned that he was having financial trouble again. He had missed several payments, and was afraid he would have to move out of his apartment. My mother immediately turned toward him. I listened as they discussed money, bills, and what could be done. Eventually, my mother looked at me and asked whether I could help Daniel with the payments. I froze. I had been saving for months. I had just put down a deposit on my apartment. I was finally trying to build something for myself. I gently explained that I couldn't keep covering everything. I said I would help him make a plan, but I couldn't become responsible for another adult's finances. The room became strangely quiet. My mother stared at me. Then she said the sentence that shattered something inside me. I wish she'd never been my daughter. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 5 seconds. Maybe a lifetime. The necklace box was still open on the table. The tiny silver tree seemed almost absurdly bright beneath the dining room light. My mother did not take it. I picked it up. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't ask why she hated me. I simply walked to the door. Outside, the air was cold, and for the first time in my life, I did not turn around. I drove home with tears running down my face. I kept replaying the sentence until it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a verdict. I thought about every birthday, every school event, every phone call, every bill I had paid, Every time I had convinced myself that her harshness came from love. And suddenly I understood something painful. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a home where I had never been asked to belong. That night, I sat on the floor of my new apartment surrounded by unopened boxes. I had no furniture except a mattress, a folding chair, and a little second-hand desk I had carried from my old place. I placed a Mother's Day gift on the floor beside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to stop making excuses for her. I cried until my chest hurt. Then something unexpected happened. I laughed. It wasn't because anything was funny. It was because I realized I was free. I didn't have to keep proving that I deserved love. I didn't have to sacrifice every dream to convince someone that I was a good daughter. I didn't have to spend my life repairing wounds I didn't create. The following weeks were difficult. My mother stopped calling. Daniel sent me a few angry messages accusing me of abandoning the family. Relatives heard a version of the story that made me sound selfish. One aunt told me that mothers could say terrible things when they were stressed. Another said I should apologize because life was short. But nobody asked what had happened before those words. Nobody asked how many times I had shown up. Nobody asked how often I had helped. Nobody asked what it felt like to hear the person who gave you life say she wished you had never existed. So I stopped explaining. I poured myself into my work. I furnished my apartment slowly. I bought a small table. Then a bookshelf. Then a blue armchair that was completely impractical but made me smile every time I looked at it. I planted herbs on the balcony. For the first time, I decorated a home according to my own taste. And little by little, I began to heal. Then, 3 months after Mother's Day, I received a letter. It wasn't a text message. It wasn't an email. It was handwritten. My mother had never been good at apologizing, so I almost didn't open it. But I did. The letter began with something I never expected to read. She admitted she had been wrong. She told me that she had spent years believing that if she made me strong enough, I would never suffer the way she had. She confessed that she had confused criticism with protection. She admitted that after my father left, she had become afraid of losing control. She had placed all her fear on me because I was the child who reminded her most of herself. Then came the part that made my hands tremble. She explained that Daniel had not simply been struggling financially. He had secretly accumulated debts that she had been covering for years. She had protected him because she felt guilty about everything he had lost after our father left. She had convinced herself that helping him was her responsibility. And on Mother's Day, when I refused to sacrifice my future to rescue him again, she panicked. She had not meant the words to become permanent. But they had. At the end of the letter, she wrote that she understood if I never forgave her. I read the letter 3 times. I wanted to call her. I wanted to run to her. I wanted to be the little girl again. But I also knew that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I could forgive her without immediately allowing her back into my life. So I waited. A week later, I visited her. When I walked through the front door, everything looked smaller than I remembered. The same hallway. The same dining room. The same chair where I had once sat doing homework while waiting for her to come home from work. My mother looked older. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she cried. Not the quiet tears I had seen during funerals or difficult movies. She cried the way someone cries when they have finally stopped pretending to be strong. She told me she was sorry. I told her that sorry couldn't erase the sentence. She nodded. I told her that I loved her. She cried harder. And then I told her something I had never been brave enough to say. I told her that loving her did not mean allowing her to hurt me. That was the beginning. Not a magical reunion. Not an instant healing. A beginning. Over the next year, our relationship changed slowly. My mother started therapy. Daniel finally took responsibility for his finances. I stopped rescuing everyone from the consequences of their choices. We learned to speak honestly instead of using guilt as a weapon. There were setbacks. There were awkward holidays. There were phone calls that ended badly. There were moments when old patterns returned. But something was different now. I no longer needed my mother's approval to know who I was. And because I no longer needed it, I could love her without begging for it. 1 year after that terrible Mother's Day, I returned to her house. This time, I brought flowers. My mother looked at them and started crying. I smiled and told her that they weren't a reward for being perfect. They were simply flowers. Because sometimes love isn't about pretending the past never happened. Sometimes love means looking directly at the wound and deciding that it will not control the rest of your life. Years later, my mother would tell people that losing her daughter for a while was the greatest wake-up call of her life. I never corrected her. Because I hadn't actually disappeared. I had simply stopped disappearing inside myself. My apartment became a home. My little design business became a company. I hired 2 young women who reminded me of myself when I was struggling, talented but uncertain, and I made sure they were paid fairly. I started donating a portion of my profits to a local organization that helped young women leaving difficult family situations. I finally understood something I had been searching for my whole life. You cannot choose the family you are born into. But you can choose the kind of person you become because of them. My mother once told me she wished I had never been her daughter. Years later, she told me she was grateful that I had been. But the most important thing was that by then, I no longer needed either sentence to define me. I had already chosen myself. And that choice saved me. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch it and scroll away. Like the video, share it with someone who may be struggling with family rejection, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Sometimes one story reaches the person who desperately needs to hear that their worth is not determined by someone else's inability to love them properly. And before we end, I have one special request. If you have ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to protect your peace, comment this sentence below. I chose myself, and I did not stop loving. You never know who might read your comment at 2 in the morning while sitting alone and wondering whether they are wrong for protecting their own heart. Remember this, being rejected by someone does not mean you are unworthy of love. Sometimes the hardest goodbye is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the moment your real life finally begins. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a daughter can do is stop begging her mother to see